This will be video 3 of chapter 4, and in this video we'll talk about electron orbits, or more specifically, how electrons are moving around the atom. This will allow us to understand the electrons' reactions, or the chemical reactions that atoms are involved in. So let's take a look first at something called the Einstein's photoelectric effect. The famous scientist Einstein was not only a physicist, but he also contributed some ideas to chemistry. Mr. Einstein's picture here for your visual pleasure. Now, he came up with the photoelectric effect, which earned him a Nobel Prize, but he said that electrons can get released using light, when light shines on a metal. So here we have light waves shining on a piece of metal, and there are atoms in the metal, so there are electrons, and he said that electrons can get ejected or released. And this happens when the light particle, a photon, strikes an electron particle in the metal. Now, this was a groundbreaking discovery because it linked essentially atoms and electrons and photons in a very interesting way. The specifics of this example said that the light had to be a certain frequency, a certain threshold frequency, to eject the electrons, which means that if the frequency of light was too small, the electrons will not get released. So the example here is if you shine, say, red light on it at 700 nanometers, and this, by the way, EV is called electron volts. It's another energy unit that's related to joules. We use joules. But he said essentially, if you shine red light on the metal, nothing happens. No electrons get emitted or get ejected. However, if you shine green light on it or blue light, electrons do get emitted. You see this electron flying off. So you need a certain frequency in order to do this. And below that certain frequency, no electron gets released. And because frequency is related to energy, you'll notice that here the lower the wavelength, the lower the energy. You notice we go from 1.7 to 2.25 to 3.1 here. So as we decrease the wavelength, notice the wavelength of light is getting shorter and shorter as we go here. The energy increases, and that's because the frequency is increasing. So the whole idea is you have to have a certain frequency in order for this to happen. And this essentially proved to us that electrons exist around the atom in certain orbits. So the picture that you see here is the electrons that exist on orbits. So here's an electron, and these orbits have certain energies. We'll call these orbits something different in a little bit, as you'll see, but for now we can call these energy levels. So the electrons can exist at different energy levels. And if you want to get, say, this electron to come off of the atom, you have to give it the right amount of energy. You have to bump it with the right amount of energy for it to escape, for it to come off. And this experiment essentially proved to us this idea of orbits around the atom. Now, there is today technology that's built on this. In fact, solar panels are built on this idea. Light from the sun will hit the solar panels and eject an electron, or remove an electron. And that electron, as it's ejected, creates electricity. So the solar panels are a way to convert light into electricity. You know that electricity is essentially the movement of electrons, or caused by the movement of electrons. So this is a very important technology that's still being developed, that the world is hoping to use for our electricity needs. So this brings us to emission spectra, and how that's related to the electron orbits that we're talking about in this lesson. And the idea here is, by the way, for your visual pleasure, we have here what are called the northern lights. You may have heard of the northern lights. If you live high up in the Earth at latitudes higher than roughly beginning with the Canada and up in Alaska, essentially, you can see what's called the aurora borealis, the northern lights. And these lights, these different colored lights, were actually made by electrons jumping between orbits. And this happens at the poles, North Pole or the South Pole. So that is a very fascinating part of nature. So here's how we will describe these electron orbits. When you take an element and you heat it, and usually you have to get it into a gas first, so you heat it up real hot. If it's a gas already, that's easy enough to do. Fill a tube with this element. In this case, a tube is filled with some sort of element. And if you heat it up, these little spirals on the tube are actually, say, metallic pieces that help to really heat up the tube. The element glows. And when we take a look at the light that the element produces as it glows, and we separate the light into its spectrum, we see all these little lines on the spectrum. Remember, this is referring to the rainbow of light produced, but you only see certain portions of the rainbow, certain light lines. You see a bunch, say, in the yellow here, a bunch in the red, a few in the blue. And the question is, how is this produced? How is the element being heated producing this spectrum? And it is all related to the electron orbits. Here is the story. When an electron that's going around an atom absorbs a specific amount of energy, we call this a quantum, a specific small amount of energy, it moves farther from the nucleus. And that's exactly what you see here. You see this electron moving farther from the nucleus. We call this being excited. The electron moves further away from the nucleus to the next energy level, to the next orbit, you can say. And when the electron is allowed to release or fall back down, the electron will fall back down to its original energy level. It will emit or release a photon of light, or radiation, because there's different types of light. So notice that's what happens. The electron jumps back down and this photon of light is released. Now the important thing is, one of the most important things to understand is that the frequency of the photon corresponds to the energy difference between the levels. So how energetic this photon is, or how its frequency essentially, is dependent on the difference between the energy levels. And remember, we gave you two equations in the previous lecture. The first equation related light as a wave. Light was wavelength times frequency. The second one related light as energy. Energy was h times v. So if you take a look at the light that's released, and if you measure its wavelength, this is wavelength, you can actually find its frequency. And then if you know its frequency, you could, through frequency, find its energy. And the energy will correspond to the energy difference in the atom. So this is how we study, this is kind of the central idea of how we study electron levels, by looking at the light that the electrons release when they go between these two different levels. This is actually a central point. So I would pause this and really look at it, invite some friends, and study this idea, these few slides. So when we take a look at the spectrum, here's hydrogen's emission spectrum. Here's what hydrogen produces when you heat hydrogen up. And you see 4 different lines, at least 4 lines, and each one of these lines corresponds to a certain wavelength, which corresponds to a certain frequency, which corresponds to a certain energy that's present in the atom. So if you take hydrogen's light and break it up, you only get this spectrum. You do not get the full rainbow. And the reason you get these 4 lines is because of hydrogen's energy levels. Here is the diagram. It's pretty complex, but here's the diagram of hydrogen's energy levels. So energy level going up this way. So energy level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way to infinity. When the electron jumps between energy level 3 and energy level 2, which corresponds to this line right here, you get yourself red light given off, because the energy difference between those 2 electrons corresponds to the frequency of red light. When the electron jumps from 4 to 2, you get green light. When it jumps from 5 to 2, you get blue light. And then you get purple light when it goes from 6 to 2. So all these transitions correspond to the light that's being released by the element hydrogen. And this is pretty fascinating. Now, there's also a bunch of light being given off that we can't see. There's some in the infrared region. When the jump is smaller, notice these jumps are smaller, you get yourself infrared light. Remember, infrared light is less energetic than visible light. when the jumps are bigger, say when you jump from energy level 6 all the way down to 1, notice how big these jumps are, this produces UV light. And remember that UV light is more energetic than visible light along the spectrum. So we can actually study the light given off by atoms and find out about the energy levels inside the electron. So this is pretty groundbreaking stuff. And to finish up, each element then has a different arrangement of electrons, and so it gives off a unique or a different color spectrum. So for these two elements, notice that their spectrum is slightly different. If you study the details of it, you'll see that the first element has a bunch of lines in the yellow region, the second has a bunch of lines in the blue region. And if we can see these lines, then we can find out about the element that was produced. In fact, here's a little factoid to share with a few friends. The element helium was actually discovered on the sun before it was discovered on the earth. That's actually what helios means. Helios is, I believe it's spelled like this, means sun, or on the sun. Now think about and discuss this among friends, and we can share this in class. How could it be that it was discovered on the sun before it was discovered on the earth? Eventually, our helium is now taken from the earth, but we discovered it on the sun before we discovered it on the earth. So this last slide shows you a few pictures of some elements heated up. Here's a nitrogen, argon, and krypton. And these are tubes essentially filled with these elements, and if you heat up these tubes, they glow. Now you'll see that they produce similar colors. You can kind of maybe tell the difference definitely between krypton, more of a blue, and argon, which is more of a maybe pinkish purplish. But many elements will produce the same exact looking light. However, if you break their spectra apart, if you break apart that light and look at their spectrum, it will be different. And here is how we identify the elements. In fact, the way scientists find out which elements are present in stars that shine down on us from very, very far, they take a look at their light spectrum. And by breaking apart their light spectrum, they can see what elements are present in the star. And this is actually pretty fascinating. So we can know what elements are on a star millions and billions and trillions of miles away just by looking at their light. And this completes for us Lesson 3 of Chapter 4.